This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Hi, I hope you're well. I hope your week has been a good one. And with some luck, you're going to find this podcast episode really, really useful. And you never know, it might even be the highlight of your week. I'm continuing on the theme of last week, where we looked at mental health literacy. This time, my guest, Dr. Andrew Shafik. We're going to go on and look at burnout, well-being, mental health, of course, and mental toughness. And we're going to be looking at elite professional football. Andrew is a club doctor. He's involved at Millwall and Chelsea Football clubs. So he goes on to share some fascinating insights. We look at things that players, coaches, support staff all experience. Enjoy. So Andrew, it's nice to meet you. Thank you for agreeing to be a guest on the podcast. Would you be able to explain to the listeners a little bit more about your background and your interest in elite professional sport?
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me on. First of all, so I suppose my background. So I studied at the University of Aberdeen. So I did my medical degree very far up north from where I am now. And while I was there, I did an intercalated degree as well in sport and exercise science. I suppose during that time, I always had an interest for sport from a young age. Football was my primary sport. And during my time at university, was lucky to play semi-professional. And I think towards the kind of second half of university, I was trying to identify what areas of medicine I was interested in and maybe what career choices and journey I was going to embark on. And I think I learned during that sport and exercise science degree, which was between the third and the fourth year of my medical studies, that this was the angle I was going to take. And I probably knew deep down before starting my medical degree, but I think that kind of confirmed my interest in the performance side. And for me, then it was important to identify whether I was interested in the medical side or the sports medicine side as such. So I started doing some shadowing bits and pieces up north in Aberdeen with the academy doctor at the time, who's currently the Aberdeen first team doctor. And that's where it really started. And at the time I was playing semi-professional football. So I suppose it was a combination of those three. And then once I started working, I started to gather experience with time. And undertook a master's degree at the University of Leeds in sport and exercise medicine. And really from there on, opportunities have presented themselves. And I think my interest in the field has grown and grown and grown.
So are you able just to explain more about the differences in sport and exercise medicine in comparison to the sports science side?
Yeah, for sure. So sport and exercise medicine, I suppose, as a specialty. So it was recognised by a specialty first in 2005. So when London got the Olympics, the GMC felt it was important to make sure we had a recognised specialty in the UK. So it was already established in other countries, and there was lots of medical practitioners already working in the environment, but it was more as on a special interest basis rather than a specialist register such as general practice, orthopedics, medicine, cardiology, etc. So unlike that. Now, sport and exercise medicine as a specialty is kind of considered as three components. So the elite sport part, the musculoskeletal medicine, which obviously has that kind of potential overlap with orthopedics, but more non-surgical. And then the exercise medicine, which is a lot more to do with physical activity for the prevention and treatment of chronic disease. So things like depression, diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, etc. Sport and exercise science is slightly different. So that's to do more with the science behind it rather than the medicine. But where we work in combination, especially in elite sport, is the bringing together that performance medicine element with the sport and exercise science team. So the way I think of elite sport, there is the sports medicine side, which is very much the understanding the injuries, the illness, the doctor side of it as such. And then the performance medicine is how can we kind of utilize our experiences working with the MDT to maximize the performance of athletes, essentially, as well as staff, if possible.
So do you notice how, as a sports psychologist, how sports psychologists how that profession's changed in terms of the management of injuries and when players are coming back from long-term serious injuries.
Yeah, so I think obviously, I mean, we were discussing before, but over time, I've not been in the field for a long time. It's probably important to say, but over time, the demand in elite sport certainly is increasing. And that's probably something that's worthwhile noting. So if you compare to maybe 10, 15 years ago, I'm sure medicine and performance departments were probably less than half the size of what they are now. And you hear some more experienced people that have been around kind of highlighting, in the late 90s, there was only one or two of them, maybe a physio and, a doctor on match days. I think now it's important to recognise that we do have a big MDT from a sports psychology point of view. We have certain clubs will have sports psychologists working on a kind of consultancy basis, but even now there are sports psychologists working on a full-time basis. So many clubs as well as associations have sports psychologists involved. And they may work across the club. So that's important to mention, whether that's with the men's team, the women's team, the boys' academy, the girls' academy. They may have a specific designated area. They may have a focus of also working with the support staff as well as the athletes. So those roles are very depending on the organisation that you're involved in. But their influence is growing, and rightfully so, because I think we recognise now that for athletes and support staff, there's not just that physical preparation element to performance, but also the mental preparation element. And that's where sports psychologists are hugely valuable to the MDT.
And like going back to the injury side, that obviously the insights you've shared there are fantastic. In terms of the injury side, do you feel that, like techniques like mindfulness and relaxation and things like that are valued more now in professional football?
I would say probably from my experience, it's a good question. I mean, I think that's one thing where we probably don't utilize as much as we can, where we actually sit in on each other's consultations to see the potential benefits. So a lot of our evidence is probably more subjective feedback from the athletes, rather than actually physically being there in a consultation to see the benefit. I think where it can really have its value, and based on the experiences with athletes that I've worked with, especially from an injury point of view, is those with longer term injuries. And long term injuries, I think it's important to identify that's what I would say is more than 28 days. So we're not talking necessarily months and months and months and months. 28 days, so 4 weeks. And I know that that's, we're seeing 28 days. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you're 27 or 26 or 21 days, you don't fall in that criteria. Athletes are, like all of us, that their performance or their sport, whether that's football or whatever it may be, that's their function. So, if you're working as a doctor, if there's a builder and he's got back pain, for example, you want to maximize the potential for them to be able to function at their day job. And I think we sometimes have to remember to translate that into our athletes. So their function is competing. And if they have an injury that's keeping them out for 28 days or, whatever time period it may be, then they essentially aren't able to do what it is that makes them tick or their function. And therefore, that's the moment I think we need to holistically bring in the MDT to try and maximize their performance. And I personally believe that's where the sports psychologist becomes such an important part of the MDT, maybe even more important than the other components, because they are not able to train, so they're not able to carry out their function. They may be with us as medical staff for 1, 2, 3 hours a day doing their rehab, but there's a huge part there that we need to work on their kind of mental aspect, mental toughness, whatever it may be that you want to define it as, so that they are ready when they come back, but that we're also managing them optimally during that process and time period.
Yeah, and I can imagine as well for the athlete who does have the serious injury, be it 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and the research will tell us that it messes with their sense of identity, doesn't it? Their self-esteem's taking a hit. And obviously, well-being was something we were going to have a look at. So, yeah, no, I completely agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I suppose this is more from the NHS, but some stats that recent research shows, I know more in the National Health Service setting, is during the pandemic, I think there were studies done that showed about 41% of people report kind of symptoms of, this is moving more towards mental health rather than necessarily burnout and well-being. And I think it's important to establish they are slightly different, but all go hand in hand. But About 41% of healthcare workers reporting symptoms of depression, anxiety, mental health related symptoms. And I think studies show that about 1 in 3 practitioners at any one time in a healthcare setting, so that's applied across the board, are experiencing burnout. So that's at any one time. This isn't just, so we'll all have experienced burnout at some point, I'm sure, but at any one time, 1 in 3. And I think when that hits home, and you're realizing you're looking to your left, to your right, and yourself, one of you is burnt out. So really, really, really important. And that's where the MDT sports psychology's input is invaluable, I believe, with support staff as well as the athletes in an elite performance setting.
Yeah, I'm pleased you mentioned there about the support staff, because essentially in a high performance environment, you're going to get, regardless whether it's a player, a coach, a sports scientist, you're going to have some seriously driven people in that environment who, when they say they're going to do stuff, they're going to do it, they're going to follow through. And that in itself can be a challenge just to rein themselves in a little bit.
No, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's probably important as a disclaimer to say that I'm not an expert from a sports psychiatry, sports psychology point of view. So my role is as a team doctor, so seeing it from a slightly different perspective. And I think you're completely right. Everyone experiences slightly different challenges. So athletes have different challenges to different types of support staff, whether that may be medical, whether that may be performance, whether that may be coaching, whether that may be, some of the others that are behind the scenes as well. And that can vary. I mean, it's a lot of these things are the similar challenges across all types of work, whether that may be, just listing some salary, annual leave. These are always the common things that come to mind. So remembering for athletes, they're continuously missing weddings, birthdays, whatever it may be. So that annual leave component falls into that. Whether they feel they're supported from above, or whether they feel they're listened to, whether they feel they're in a learning environment, whether they feel from a cultural point of view in the environment, they can be open to communicate, whether they have those relationships with their colleagues or teammates or support staff, their agents, again, some of the external sources, finances, etc. So it's massive, massive differences. And I think in football specifically, it varies as well, depending on where you are. So whether it's the men's or the women's game. So we know there's lots of, so Karen Carney's done some work on this, and I did an interview with her for our next FA Medical Society event. And she spoke a bit about some of the challenges specific to female athletes, and, the effect of the menstrual cycle, but also the difference between the different stages of career. So whether you're at academy level, you're at senior level, whether you're retiring, and that kind of exit component part of your playing career into what may happen next. And also differences between club and country. So lots of challenges which change depending on, I suppose, the environment you're in, what stage of your career you're in as well, but they can differ massively for players, but also support staff.
Yeah, and I suppose one thing you haven't mentioned there would be the fact that certainly with players, that they're moving around quite a lot. So just when they're changing from culture to culture, club to club, country to country, that's going to have a huge impact.
Yeah, it's not uncommon. You hear stories of transfer deadline day, and you've got players, unfortunately, in the airport unsure, where their next move is, and it may make excitement for the population that are watching on Sky Sports News, I'm sure, but it's I'm sure none of us would like that to be happening in our own personal life, because it's a high level of uncertainty, especially if you've got family, wife, kids, even or if you're on your own. It's a lot of uncertainty to not know where your next step of your career necessarily is. So I think that alone needs to be managed, and different athletes, depending again on their, I suppose, mental toughness or the state of play, will manage that or feel differently about that specific scenario. And it's identifying those that you feel probably need a greater level of support, but even those who don't necessarily need the support, you might not always know, because athletes may not come and seek that support. And a big thing I suppose I'm interested in at the moment is the support kind of networks, whether it's support psychology, whether it's welfare, whatever you may have in a club and an association, any line of work. Is it optimal to have that within the organization? So your designated sports psychologist or your designated counselor, whatever it may be, or should they be external and independent of the organization, so that, would that influence athlete and support staff feeling that they're communicating with someone that they don't know? And I think that's one that I definitely don't have the answer to, but be interesting to find out what other people think.
Mm. I know I've got a view on that one myself. With just with being an outsider, I suppose, to vast majority of clubs, and certainly in our profession, trust and the relationship is confidentiality is massively essential. Often, I find a player when they know you're not involved in the club quite does actually quite like that, because nobody at the club knows, and they know what's spoken about isn't going to get back to the coach or the manager or any support staff. So that obviously has an impact, especially in a team sport where the manager picks the team, and then in some cases there's like fear cultures in there.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a place for both, would be my opinion on the matter. I think, and it can vary, and different people respond differently. So I think some, I'll give an example of in a healthcare setting where I had a colleague who did seek advice from someone in a more of a welfare position to support them internally. And I think what they described to me they found really beneficial was they felt they saved about 20 minutes from explaining the background. But I totally agree with what you're saying as well. I think athletes sometimes it can be preferable to speak to someone who doesn't have the association with the organization, who's completely a separate entity and doesn't, they feel that they are, I mean, it's always in confidence, but the athlete really feels that kind of above and beyond in confidence, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I think there's also probably something to be said about in the club settings, be it the physio, the doctor, the coaches, having an awareness of, I was going to say, motivational interviewing, Stephen Rolnick's work, so that they're able to empathize better with and listen to the players or the staff members, and so I suppose they're on a upskill process, if you like, that can only be beneficial.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I suppose it kind of comes back to what we were saying a bit more at the start, from the difference between sports medicine and performance medicine. And I suppose you probably gain that with experience. That's something I'm trying to understand personally a little bit more in my line of work. But rather than, I suppose the sports medicine might be a bit more when someone's coming in to see you, saying, I've got low mood or I'm burnt out, doc, or whatever it may be. Whereas the performance medicine maybe might be that little bit more prevention of, the players undergoing rehab with a physio. They're not as engaging as much on that day. Their body language just doesn't feel the same. They're normally someone who will come in and shake your hand or give you a fist bump, say hello, engage with you first, ask how your day is. Whereas they've come in maybe a couple of minutes late. You're feeling that it just feels different. And I suppose sometimes it is that feel and it feels a little bit different. But the action that we're then taking to try and identify what we think maybe the issue is and potential solutions that we can put into play. And that includes utilising the NDT in that situation. So yeah, I think that filters into a bit of kind of what you've mentioned there.
Yeah, most definitely. In terms of mental toughness, obviously you've touched on it a few times, and it is the name of the podcast. What do you see? What's your definition of mental toughness in an elite football environment?
It's a really good question. I think this is something I've thought about a lot more over this last, I would probably say, season, just because it's when my interest in the area of kind of burnout and well-being has really taken off. And I think the one thing from speaking to actually a recent conversation with a sports psychiatrist was, I've identified I think there's a difference between mental toughness, mental health, burnout, and well-being. And they're all actually, the terms filter into one. And for some people, they may seem similar, and it depends on your interpretation of definitions. But to me, mental toughness is kind of performing under continual stress and pressure. And that's what can filter into burnout, potentially, that physical or emotional or psychological exhaustion. And that's where you see the performance decrements, which can happen, as we were saying, to athletes or staff. And then the mental health is like the holistic component. So it's everything. So the emotional, the psychological, the social well-being. I think that the thing that I've learned the most was doing a mental health post in the NHS, a psychiatry post, and trying to actually understand the individual, the patient, the athlete in front of you from the bottom to the top, and covering every little detail. We're talking your developmental history, your childhood history. I'm not saying we should ask athletes necessarily to that level of detail, but you're getting to know them really from the bottom up, the family history of physical illness, of mental illness, any previous forensic issues, any triggers that we can actually see that contribute. Now, obviously, a lot of the time, if it's an injured player in our medical room, we know most likely that's the trigger. But you're with that athlete for half a day. You don't know what's going on at home. And it's the same with colleagues, isn't it? In any line of work, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And you have to be in a mental state yourself, I think, where you are in a happier place to sometimes identify it in others. So if I'm not feeling 100% at work, I'm going to be focusing on my own issues a little bit more that day, probably, than the person in front of me. And trying to compartmentalize and split that so that you're identifying, okay, this is my role at work today, and trying to split that will allow you, I suppose that's one of the biggest challenges for anyone in any line of work. But it's the same as, we've all taken that, couple of weeks longer where you find out a colleague isn't doing as great, and you think back to yourself, there's probably evidence there that I should have picked up on. And maybe that comes with experience. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's a few different things that have popped up into my mind. I suppose a part of mental toughness is interpersonal confidence. So, in effect, being able to communicate well. And obviously, you're going to come across, well, whether it's players, support staff, who aren't great communicators and aren't going to talk about their feelings very well. So, I suppose what you're saying there about knowing the person and just really getting to understand them, I would like to think would allow them to then open up more and sort of self-disclose. But then you've probably got the challenge in a high-performance football environment where the line is, well, how much do I want to disclose is possibly there. It's a big area, isn't it, really? And probably a whole podcast in itself.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, though. I mean, I think during the pandemic, the CQC did some work to try and identify what they thought were some of the kind of key solutions or points that they could try and help influence the mental health of doctors based on some of the studies and numbers that we mentioned earlier. And one of them was creating safe spaces, which I think you've touched on there in the relation of would they communicate with practitioners because of what may get back to coaches or whatnot. And the safe space in that setting, I suppose, filters into what we were speaking about previously, whether that's speaking to a practitioner internally or externally. That would be their, that's the potential safe space. So I suppose our role in that setting might be to identify those we think could benefit from that based on some of the triggers that we've mentioned. It's really interesting. One of my close friends works in Australia, and he's chief medical officer of Perth State. He won't mind me mentioning this on the podcast. And having worked in the National Health Service and moved over there, they get a lot of, obviously, British doctors go over there for a period of time. And one thing that he mentions that is very unique to their system is that they've got kind of a director of staff welfare on their board. So with him sitting on the board, they've got a director of staff welfare that's specifically designated to look at staff and their own individual well-being. So I suppose we've kind of spoken on a couple of points there. Is the culture, the safe space, the communication element, but having that designated individual or point of contact as well.
Yeah, where I suppose that links as well to the culture and the values of the organisation, doesn't it? And how seriously they see staff well-being and player welfare. Yeah, it's a really fascinating topic to be talking about.
Yeah.
One thing you also mentioned was about where you talked about the NHS and yourself and just looking after yourself and the importance of self-care as a practitioner or as a coach. That's so important because we think of the pressure managers and coaches are under. It's extreme. They could be out of a job quite easily within a few months in some cases.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I suppose it comes back to kind of the bit we were speaking about previously with the difference between player support staff, men, women, academy, club, country, etc. I think there's more initiatives and programs that are identifying and raising awareness of this topic generally now and trying to devise potential solutions. As I said, whether internally or externally. I was lucky to do a podcast with Stephen Reed, I know spoken out quite a lot recently about his time as a player and also as a support staff and the challenges he faced and how that's kind of led into his career post football now and the work he's doing in well-being, confidence, and leadership. I think you're very much right in saying, we know what the challenges of football are. We know also that, we've mentioned obviously some of them in the sense of missing, every weekend, potentially missing birthdays, missing major events, the potential working hours, and also the culture we know across the game indicates that it's always about being more available and being there more and more and more. And that's kind of, if something's not right, we put in more time into it. And that's probably not just across football and sport and elite performance and performing environments. And that's where it's probably actually different to the NHS. In the NHS setting, in many ways, we're kind of shift workers. So you do your shift and you leave. So there's not that element of, if you've not had a great day at work, you have to be doing more. Certain individuals could be, but that is a little bit different because it's a shift base rather than a task base from a job point of view. And I think sometimes that's thought to be the first solution in many ways, putting in more time. And Stephen really spoke about that really well on the podcast, actually, and he's someone that's really useful to learn about in relation to those experiences about playing and coaching staff.
Yeah, the similarities there with being self-employed. I know I've been there at times where I've overworked, and when I've spoken to other self-employed people or like entrepreneurial, like high-ranking directors and companies, you're not just a 9-to-5 person or a 12 to late or wherever it is. There is that danger where you do, and you overdo it. And these roles often can be quite lonely as well, can't they? So, I suppose having that support system around you to be able to like point the finger and look, you're falling into this trap is so important. And then again, just having some self-awareness yourself is vital.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it kind of comes back to listening to what you said there. It makes me reflect on, again, my psychiatry post where they do something called a Ballant group, which I'm not sure if listeners may or may not have come across that concept before. But it's essentially where someone presents a case. So it's a kind of a circle of practitioners, whatever it may be. And I think it was developed by a chap called Michael Ballant, early 90s, whenever it may be. And it's a safe space where you come together for a period of time, say 45 minutes, an hour. Someone presents a case, can be clinical, can be completely non-clinical, or just a life interaction that they had. And then they speak about their reflections, and then everyone in the group kind of chips in, whether they've got questions, whether they kind of bounce off their previous experiences as well. And I think that kind of filters into what you're saying. I'm not saying that's something that may be viable in a lot of workplaces. If you're working in the same workplace and you're saying you've had a conflict with, because people can deduce who the conflict might be with in a workplace, it might be something you're doing a little bit more external with, colleagues who are self-employed as well, for example, and having that case-based discussion type element. And that comes back to a couple of the bits you've spoken about actually and highlighted. So that kind of communication but also the self-reflective practice and reflecting on the challenges that we're facing and why we found them challenging in our thought process in the lead up to that, and how we may how we may essentially act differently in the future. But I suppose if you've not had that experience before, it's the first time in that situation, isn't it? So every time you have that cumulative experience of that situation, you deal with it, you probably, or you'd like to think you deal with it differently and optimize it every time.
Yeah, then you're in a better position to deal with it moving forwards. Yeah, as you say, I suppose, the reflection bit there and being able to learn from the experiences is a vital one.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've loved the conversation. Some fantastic insights into your world and profession there. Would you like to share with the listeners 3 key takeaways from what we've spoken about?
3 key takeaways. Yeah, so I suppose I think it's important to highlight that my role as a team doctor is a little bit different to a sports psychiatrist or a sports psychologist. But the things I've probably learned so far would be, I think, you need a culture, a specific culture. I think a lot of it always comes from the top. And if you have that specific culture coming right from the top of the organization, I'm a big believer it really does filter down the way. I suppose in relation to the topic as well, probably a designated point of contact, whether that's for welfare, well-being, mental health, psychology, whether again that's internal, external, a combination, which I think might be, optimal for different reasons. I think that's really, really important as well for people to have that kind of point of contact to speak to. I suppose the third thing is the openness for the communication, and that filters in again with, I suppose, culture and that point of contact, whether that's through reflection, shared decision making. I suppose we spoke a bit about the story about the Ballant group, but also kind of communicating with that point of contact. I think if we've got those three things, then we can optimize probably the mental aspects of our athletes and support staff in an elite performance environment.
Excellent. No, some great little tips there, and yeah, thank you for sharing. And again, obviously, thank you for your time. Are you able to just point the listeners to any social media or events that you've got coming up soon?
Yeah, so social media, personal social media on Twitter, a Shafik, or on LinkedIn. We're trying to do some work in this space at the moment, also focusing on support staff. So the FMPA podcast with Stephen Reed, which you'll find for free on the FMPA website. And we've got an FA Medical Society event coming up on Monday, the 6th of March. So we've got some ex-players, Karen Carney, Stephen Cocker, current player. We've got sports psychologists speaking on the well-being of athletes and staff. We've also got sports psychiatrists, so a nice mix there. So if you just, you'll find it on Eventbrite, or if you Google the FA Medical Society event on burnout and well-being in football. And then probably the last thing to maybe mention is we've got a master's student doing a research project on this at the moment. So looking into burnout and well-being in medical and performance practitioners in football. So hopefully if you watch this space, we may have something that we're trying to get published in the not too distant future on this work. So yeah.
Great. I'll certainly keep my eyes open, and the different links there I'll pop in the show notes. So if people want to contact you, or if they want to book onto the event, they certainly can. So again, a big thank you. So that was another enjoyable episode that we've recorded there. A big thank you to Andrew for his time. And as the conversation progressed, it really got me thinking about mental toughness and the qualities involved in a mentally tough person. Now, in elite sport, you find that a lot of folk, whether that's a player, coach, support staff, they are highly committed, highly motivated people. They're dedicated to what it is that they do. They often sleep, breathe, and eat football or their chosen sport. And, no doubt this is a really good quality. It's a great quality to have in any field, any walk of life. And then if you throw in another C, so commitment was the first one, another of the 4 C's, confidence. So having confidence in your ability, again, it's not a bad thing. Certainly isn't. It's about having self-belief. So believing in yourself in difficult situations, in situations which perhaps are pressurized. Again, another good skill. And then the third C, we'll have challenge. So maybe, a mentally tough person or a person in this sort of elite sport environment may like taking risks. They might enjoy new challenges. And that again is fantastic. But then if we throw in control, the last of the 4 C's, and the emotional control aspect, there will be people out there who don't show their emotions openly. So you wouldn't actually know what they're experiencing. So, if we do add all of these ingredients together, we do see a mentally tough person, no doubt about it. And, mental toughness is a good thing. But what I'd like the listeners to think about is, what are the downsides to being committed? What are the downsides to being confident? What are the downsides to being high scoring and challenge? Do you take too many risks? Do you actually commit to too many things? Do you take on too much? And then if people can't read you, do they actually know that something is wrong? This is something to factor in. And if you do want to know a little bit more about this, what you perhaps could do is take a psychometric test. It would be the MTQ+. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about this, whether it's for yourself or for your team, please do get in touch. it is something that I have access to, and I am a licensed practitioner. So as I say, it is good to be mentally tough. It is helpful. There's lots of positives, but there are some downsides, especially when it comes down to your well-being and your mental health. The key is, as I'll say time and time again on this podcast, it's about self-awareness. And if you do want to try and improve that self-awareness, as well as doing the MTQ Plus, what you might want to do is actually just sign up to the Mental Edge newsletter, which comes out every Friday, where I have a little ramble and I share plenty of insights, be it blogs, be it podcasts from different people to help you. In the meantime, take care and have a great week. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sports psychology resources. The Sport-Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.